So things we're hoping to do today is one, think about within synchronous online learning. So this sort of real-time discussions over something like Zoom, over Google Meet, over virtual classroom, what to think about doing within synchronous time versus doing asynchronously within teaching. We want to consider a few different approaches to synchronous teaching. So some full class activities, some with kind of small groups. And finally, think about how to kind of prepare students for synchronous learning. So things to be doing on a regular basis, things to do early on within the semester to kind of get students started. I'm looking at the chat here as well. So several things people are excited about: talking to students again, seeing students again, seeing students in kind of a face-to-face, at least a virtual setting, learning new ways to connect with students. So a lot of things people are kind of considering here. As we get started, let me mention just some background, things that came out, especially from the spring relationship to students' perspectives on synchronous versus asynchronous learning. So a pretty large nationwide survey went out to about over 3,000 students in April. So about a month into the sudden move to pandemic teaching, to get students' perspectives on just how that semester was going. Again, with full recognition that that semester, this upcoming semester, are not typical online semester by any means. They're very much still kind of emergency teaching semesters. But students' responses in terms of how they were experiencing learning in the spring, 85% of students said they missed face-to-face interaction with faculty. So a large majority of students. 53% of students said they felt like they no longer had access to faculty. So from their perspective, they felt like they didn't have regular access to faculty that they did before moved online teaching. 86%, so that biggest percentage, said they missed socializing with other students. 69% that felt that they no longer had regular access to other students as well. So even though they felt like, hey, I'm seeing my faculty, my instructor a lot less, it was a much more, I feel like I'm much less regularly seeing my other classmates as well. And then the last piece, which to me, when I look at in relationship to the previous points, is kind of interesting and surprising to sit in for just a second or two. So 39% of students said that they did not enjoy or see the value in real-time online learning, meaning these sort of synchronous class sessions. One of the things that sticks out to me there is that while it seems like overwhelming majority of students miss seeing their classmates and miss seeing faculty, a decent size of students, 40%, didn't necessarily see synchronous learning as the absolute sort of fix to that or a go-to. And so there's several things we kind of unpack with that, but one of the big things is recognizing that we'll think a lot about benefits of synchronous online learning and different approaches to that, but that it's not going to be a direct sort of one-to-one replacement for a face-to-face classroom. There's a lot of things to think about with it still being a different environment that it would be sort of in your face-to-face classes. To think about just some of the benefits of synchronous learning, and Colleen will get into this a bit more when she talks about sort of choosing between synchronous versus asynchronous content. For those of you who've talked with students back and forth through email or through phone, you might recognize that it's a lot easier to problem solve often in a synchronous setting. So rather than kind of going back and forth through kind of emails, if you've been able to talk to students on the phone or colleagues in a synchronous session through sharing screens and other things, it'll be a lot easier to kind of talk through discussion, problem solve in the moment. It can be a lot easier in synchronous sessions to, for lack of a better term, kind of have a more dynamic and multimodal lesson. So within the span of 45 minutes, having large class discussions, small group time, individual time to work in a way that asynchronously can be a lot harder to kind of manage in a small periods. And last thing I'll mention in terms of a benefit to synchronous versus asynchronous learning is that arguably in a synchronous setting like Zoom or virtual classroom or Google Meet, it can be a lot easier to gauge students' learning experience. By that, I don't mean sort of students' demonstration of learning, so things like seeing how well they're doing in terms of learning objectives, but more just how they're experiencing the class in terms of picking up on vocal cues, students' affectation and discussion. Synchronous settings can make that a lot simpler to kind of test the pulse of how students are feeling at that point.
So welcome to the session, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how, and this is personal, how I've decided to organize, and I think this is really based on looking at kind of a blended learning approach. So I looked at how would you deliver some things asynchronously and some things that you might want to deliver synchronously. So of course there's lots of material that you can deliver asynchronously. If you are going to record lectures or if there's readings, If students are being asked to do some sort of exam, you know, you might want to have that as an asynchronous type of activity. They can practice materials, and I think many of us have resources that we use for students to practice materials. And I've also kind of had an intentional thought about discussions. So I use the discussion board asynchronously with my students, but I'm really intentional about what kinds of questions I'm going to ask there. So those questions might be questions that are more reflective of where we are right now in the process. It's not just because I want to force them to go on to a discussion. I want to really have them think. But then there's things that I've noticed, and I synchronously, I think, are important. And the first thing I mentioned was a mental health check-in. I think at the start of every class, I do a how are we doing kind of activity in a normal year. And I think this is really, really an important thing to do in a synchronous class. You can do it many different ways, but I want to see the faces of my students to see that they're doing okay. And if there's a problem, that they have an opportunity right now to address any questions that they might have in the class. So that's part of my synchronous class. Also, the synchronous class is one place where we can collaborate. So we use tools to brainstorm, to peer review, to create things. And I think for students, if we give them an activity that they have to collaborate on, it feels like more like a classroom experience, like a small group experience that you might have in the classroom. And then you can apply skills. So if there's something that you want that you've taught them that you want them to apply, you can do that in the synchronous session as well. So those are just some ideas of how I'm thinking about separating my classes this fall. Tyler's okay. So we were looking at the difference between having a full class or a small class activity. So I'm going to show you a few things, but in a full class activity, there's lots of things that you're able to do with your class by sharing your screen. And I'm going to, there's lots of things that I probably will be doing more often in the beginning, like navigating through D2L, especially if there's something new that we're going to do, showing them online resources, collaborating in a document as a whole class collaboration. One thing that we've noticed is, and I think this happened in our spring classroom, is that students reminded us that we weren't able to multitask as much as we thought we could. So one thing that we've started to do is have a student be responsible for the chat. So if you're asking students to ask questions, make sure that there's somebody there, that's their role. Because oftentimes you get in the middle of this process and you forget to check the chat. In fact, I haven't looked at the chat. So it's really important to have somebody helping you out there. It's important though that you do not make this a very long part of the session. So I think students get fatigued by just listening to the whole group kind of interaction. So I'm just going to show you a few things that I might do. And I know that if you've done this before, I know that this is a repetition, but if you haven't, there's a lot of easy things that you can do with sharing your screen in the Zoom meetings. Okay, I think this will, so I think everybody can probably see all my courses, hopefully. And so one of the things that I might do, especially with my students, ESL students, is this might be the first time that they've had to negotiate an asynchronous session. So I might go through my class and demonstrate how to do something. So for example, if I want them to do a discussion, I can show them the discussion and I can demonstrate how I might do it. And I think that's helpful for students to be able in real time to see you move through your LMS if there's something that you want them to accomplish. We can't assume that some of them might be really, really good at all these processes, but not everybody. Another thing that you can do, so this is really more of a demonstration. Another thing that I have done in my classes is maybe we're going to do an assessment of some process. So right now, maybe my students are going to be moving through transitioning from writing a paragraph to an essay. And so I'm feeling a little bit nervous here because I know we have English professors out there, but let's say that this is a paragraph. I could ask you as the students to help me figure out the structure of the paragraph, and I can demonstrate that in a document that everybody can see. So if I'm asking you to say, well, where do you think perhaps the topic sentence of this paragraph is, I can look in the chat, students can tell me what they think, and then I can work through that process. If you're doing some editing on some work, you can very easily show the whole class how to do that by demonstrating stuff. So with my students, this would be really instrumental because when they're looking at the transition, we can pull out the parts and then move to the next stage of our writing process. So those are just a couple ideas of what you might be able to share, but you can share web resources online. And it's really easy for the students, once they get used to negotiating the chat or raising their hand, it's very easy for them to contribute to that process. So let's see, thank you. So we'll go to the next.
Move on, just a couple of things to reiterate from what Colleen said. One is that point about sort of overload in a Zoom session. Just even now, as you can tell from, there's a lot of things to kind of keep track of in the sense of the chat, seeing kind of visuals that are on the screen, the speaker, additionally, that's without even sort of taking notes as people do. So just really to reiterate the point Colleen made about assigning those roles to students and having those rotate potentially each week, each lesson, and one student being in charge of the chat to kind of monitor for questions and bring up those points, as well as assigning students to be taking notes. Often I think that's a good idea to kind of encourage a group of students of, hey, for this particular lesson, these two students are going to be in charge of sort of taking notes in a Google Doc for everyone in the class to access, to give other students a little bit more of a breather to certainly still take their own notes if they want to, but know if they want to choose not to take notes to kind of be fully present in what's happening on the screen or in the chat, that can be an option. They'll still get pieces there. The other thing, just to reiterate quick from what Colleen said, is that I appreciate her sharing the Word document there of the student's paragraph, because I think something that seems a little simple, but is that we often can think about share screen as sort of a static image. So admittedly, the slides here are slides that Colleen and I have worked on, but sharing screen of a Word document to be typed in with students or having students be typed in as well, that doesn't have to just be the sort of static image being shared on the screen, but absolutely you can kind of create things as you go there.
Absolutely. So some of our activities, there's a lot of interactive activities. So we're going to demonstrate a few. We're going to demonstrate polling, which you can do. It requires you to set it up before class. But if you're interested in getting a sort of a feel for how the students are doing in a certain area, you can poll them and then demonstrate the poll to them. You can use the chat, of course, and the whiteboard. The whiteboard feature is something that might be useful if you're trying to do a kind of board feature in your classroom. So if it's your chalkboard, you can utilize and to demonstrate things also for your class. The one thing that you have to do at the beginning is for the students to understand how you're going to facilitate your discussions. So if chat is the way that you're going to do your discussions, that's great. With a smaller classroom, you may have them hand raise, so that once a hand is raised, they'll unmute themselves and talk. And I think this is really a wonderful thing to practice at the beginning so that you have an interactive class where students feel like they can participate and talk. But that's just really a process of getting used to how you're going to answer questions in the classroom, whether it's chat or by speaking. And then finally, you can do things individually. So I did this in one of my classes last semester. They had to do something. They had to do some writing. And you can put them all individually in a breakout rooms of one person, and they can actually work on something. And if you're sitting there and watching it because it's copied to you in Google Docs, you can see where people are having problems. You can see that they're processing through the work that you're doing or not. But there is time in a synchronous session to say, okay, let's do some free writing. I'm going to give you 5 minutes. Here's the prompt. Go, and you can watch it happen around you, which I think is also an active way for students to be in a synchronous class, similar to what you might do in your class if you were sitting in the classroom. So I think that Tyler is going to start a poll for us.
Yeah, so I'm going to bring up a poll here in just a moment that has 3 kind of just questions to get people's reactions and thoughts on. For this poll, again, we're using Zoom today. Whoops, let me go back for a moment. So creating polls on Zoom, let me say an FYI, for demonstrating each of these particular features, we're going to demonstrate them, but not today go over an exact sort of how to do this. I'll absolutely follow up with a resource guide for each of these features. If here's how to get into Zoom and create a poll, here's how to get into D12 Virtual Classroom and use these features as well. We're not going over these today as much in terms of detail of how exactly to do it, just because those are pieces that often can be learned asynchronously a bit better. If you have questions, absolutely feel free to reach out to us. So I'm going to bring up a poll here. You should see it now. It says, synchronous sample poll in progress. I have a timer up on my screen that shows me as the instructor how long the poll has been going on. For these, in terms of the polls, so I can see as the instructor view how many people have answered questions. I get a sense of the percentages as well. To create these questions, it's something that I would say is absolutely best done in advance. One little drawback I would say to Zoom is, at least to my knowledge, I haven't figured out a way to copy polls into multiple sessions. So usually it's just kind of creating a poll particular to a session. What I'll say with that, as you're kind of filling things out, is that benefits of polls, as Colleen mentioned, is to assess learning, to ask some kind of low stakes questions, to think about kind of student experience as well. I've set up this poll to be completely anonymous. And so I'm not going to get any kind of report of who answered what. Within Zoom, you can choose to make the polls not anonymous, though, and you can actually get a report of who answered what. So if you are wanting to kind of assess learning, ask kind of low stakes completion questions, maybe you can see sort of what students said what on the poll. Again, I'll mention these 3 questions as people are answering. The questions are, how long have you taught at ECC? Ideally, how long should a synchronous class activity be before moving on to the next activity or component? So if you're having a discussion, if you're having breakout rooms, a demonstration, how long before you think, okay, let's move on to the next piece? And then right now, what are your preferences for synchronous online platform? And so we'll give a little bit longer for folks to vote. And as the last votes are coming in these last 10 or 20 seconds, the last thing I'll mention before I'll go ahead and share the results of this, just to kind of demonstrate how you can see it as well. With the polling feature, again, it can be used absolutely to assess kind of low stakes pieces. I would really discourage people from using polling for things like quizzes or exams that are going to have a bit more weight in terms of the grading. Reason being is, even though you can see who answered what, it can be very easy to erase the polling results. And at least for me, I would not be comfortable having something that's going to be considered some sort of grade or a decent sized grade being just located within sort of a Zoom poll. I wouldn't quite have the full trust of it to do that. So absolutely fun to use, a good interactive tool, but for assessments, I would say use probably a different feature. Okay, so 10 seconds, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and we'll take a look at the results here. Okay.
Oh, wow.
So polling has ended. I'm going to go ahead and share the results. So again, you all should be able to see this now in terms of what votes came in. So we've got, it looks like a lot of experience in the room in terms of how long people have taught at ECC. So the majority of folks have been here for longer than 10 years. Excellent. Several folks 5 to 10 as well. Ideally, how long should a synchronous class activity be before moving on to the next activity or component? So majority of folks are thinking 5 to 15 minutes. So again, keep activities pretty short. And Colleen kind of mentioned that early on too, about trying to keep things pretty short in the synchronous session before kind of moving on to keep things active and lively. Good, no one said over 45 minutes, which is encouraging. What synchronous online platform do you currently prefer? So it's like majority liking Zoom. Oh, it's good to see though. Some folks do like D12 Virtual Classroom and Google Meet as well. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing results here. Couple more things in terms of Zoom polling. If I wanted to relaunch the poll, I have the opportunity to do so. A good thing to be able to bring up in terms of active learning, have discussions about what people did, especially in smaller groups. having a longer discussion to kind of interpret what people did or kind of follow up is a really helpful piece to do.
So let's see. So now we're going to talk about some of the small group activities that you can do in your synchronous classes. One of the things that I like about Zoom, and I have to say, in all honesty, I say this to my class as well. I'm a digital immigrant. I did not grow up using digital tools. I'm old enough that I used a Selectric typewriter when I did my first master's degree. So I always told my students that I'm learning this with you. And so I don't have experience with a lot of different formats, but I've been using Zoom. So one of the things that I think is really nice about the breakout room in Zoom is that you have a lot of different opportunities to do different things. So the easiest thing to do is randomly put students in rooms. And what you get a choice of how many rooms and how many people. And that's pretty easy. And then you click a button and they join their rooms. Or you can pre-assign rooms before. I thought about this because, for every different task, you have a different number of students that you want to have in a room. So it's really flexible based on your task. I have had one, and then I've had 6 or 7 people in a room, depending on what they're supposed to be doing. And if there's more people in a room, it's based on something that's very active, perhaps, that we're doing in the class. I have not done this, but you know this if you are in classrooms, that oftentimes when you're doing group work, you have a reason to put a cohort together. That reason may be, there's a lot of reasons when you might choose a cohort. So it's possible that you might decide in these breakout rooms to have a cohort work through a period of time in the semester. Perhaps it's because you want to differentiate the knowledge in the group. There might be other reasons. Maybe they're working on a project, so that group has to stay together. But you can do that as well, which is really, really nice. So there's a lot of flexibility in how you organize. And what I've been doing is making sure that there's some roles that you might do in a small group anyway. I want them to come out with a product, so I want to make sure that they feel some responsibility for that project. So I might have somebody who's responsible for reporting or note-taking. You might have somebody who's working through questions with the group. So they might be the person who's asking questions, but it really depends on the activity. The duration, and we got some really great results from you, really is based on what you're doing. It's task-based. The one thing I like about it is that I can walk around the rooms like I walk around a regular room by jumping into each breakout room. So I know that they don't always appreciate that you're jumping in because it seems a little invasive, but I always tell them beforehand, I'm going to come in your rooms just to make sure that you're okay, if you need anything. So they're aware that I might jump in to their rooms. Usually when I jump in, I'm really looking for dead air. I'm looking to make sure that things are happening. And it's never happened when I jump in a room that something isn't happening with the work. So it might just be that I have the greatest students ever, that's possible. But if you give them something that a product that they have to complete, I think they're more likely to be busy when you're in their breakout rooms. The other thing that's really nice is they can ask me for help. So I practiced this yesterday. I have a book club with some students, and I said, just ask me for some help. And it's really easy. It'll just show up, this group wants you to come in and help them out, which is really nice because I know where to go and I can go in and I can help them in their process. So, so the breakout rooms have really been a great tool for me. I usually use a shared document for the students. They can either create and share with me, or I might share something with them. And because then if I'm sitting outside of the breakout rooms, I can monitor the progress of the document. So I can see them all and I can see who's working through the process. and I can see if there's a group that's stalled. So it's really nice. You're almost like you're walking around and asking questions virtually, which I like a lot. So we're going to try to do this with you. We're going to put you in breakout rooms. I'm saying we, but I really think it's Tyler who's going to put you in breakout rooms. And we're going to try to see if you can work through a question for us. So
I'm going to stop share for a minute here. As Colleen mentioned, so we are going to demonstrate being in breakout rooms from the student perspective. And so in just a moment here, I'll put people into breakout rooms of 4 and 5. And again, this is one of those things that if I could share how I'm doing this in Zoom, I'd be thrilled to. To my understanding, it's impossible to kind of share my Zoom features live. And so I'll be sharing tutorials about how to do that later on. And so I'm going to put people in breakout rooms of 4 or 5. As Colleen mentioned, a really helpful thing to do is to give people a document or something to be working within, a kind of a deliverable. And so to that end, right now within the chat, I am going to share a link to a Google Doc. And so we've set up a Google Doc that includes 3 questions for the groups to talk about. And I'll share the Google Doc again once we get started here, but 3 questions to discuss within your group. The questions are, if I can pull up my version here, what do you think is the most challenging thing as a learner in online synchronous learning? What do you think is the most challenging thing as an instructor with an online synchronous learning? And finally, what tools or approaches do you plan to explore more and further implement this fall? So don't start typing anything quite yet. What I'll do is once you're in your group, the 2 things to do first. One is just do real quick introductions. Don't take too long with that, but just name what you're teaching just so you can familiarize yourself with who you're speaking with. Secondly is try and nominate somebody to be the one person in the group to take notes into the Google Doc. So if you want to self-volunteer and say, hey, I'll be happy to type in the Google Doc where our discussion is, great. Otherwise, maybe nominate somebody. So go through quick introductions, who wants to take notes in the Google Doc. Once the rooms have started, I'll jump into the different rooms and kind of say, hey, you all are group 1, you all are group 2, you all are group 3. So you know where to navigate and type things into the Google Doc. Again, if this doesn't turn out perfectly, that's quite all right. It's more of kind of a demonstration to see how this looks. I'm going to set the rooms for 15 minutes. So on my end, as the instructor, I get to control how long you're in those rooms. I'm going to set these for 15 minutes. You'll have a bit of time to kind of discuss and think through this. If you have any questions at all, feel free to follow up. I'm going to set up those rooms now. And you should, in just a moment, be whisked off into a room of about 4 or 5 other people. Okay? Hey, sorry to jump in. Can you all be group 1?
We're group 1.
Everybody's back in here. So I'm going to start recording again. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen to just look at the Google Doc, see what people sort of typed in there. So looking within this a little bit. So some of the things that came up. And one thing I'll say is as I'm kind of scrolling through this, we won't spend too much time doing this. Within obviously an actual class session, it's helpful to kind of digest, unpack things for a while as a class. Right now, if you want to, though, within the chat, just share if that was your first time being in a breakout room, how the experience was. What did you find helpful about it? What did you find challenging about it? Is it something you foresee yourself doing as an instructor? And so let me scroll down here. So what do you think is the most challenging thing as a learner online synchronous learning? Staying focused, distractions, absolutely. As the instructor, not knowing the technology, having computer issues when in front of students. Going down a little bit more, not having real-time access to the instructor, certainly. Helping students understand the system that we're using. So certainly if different faculty have desires and interests in different platforms, the challenge of students having to kind of learn a different platform for each class and become familiar with that certainly is a lot to ask. Lack of spontaneous private conferencing, not knowing how to use all the technology available. And looking down through others, several things came up with helping students sort of with tech issues, as well as yourself as instructor not knowing exactly how to use the technology being used, or having sort of tech issues in front of students. The only thing I'll say in relationship to that for right now is that, similar to in a face-to-face class setting, there's the moments of not knowing answers to questions, things not working out well, absolutely just acknowledging that with students and asking for students' feedback. And if students have used Zoom a lot more than you have as the instructor, absolutely asking for their feedback and advice as you move forward with that. So I didn't want to dwell on that too much. I want to spend a little bit of time in small groups. So moving forward a little bit, Colleen and I wanted to shift and talk a little bit about ways to prepare your students for the session. So information that they'll need to join the session, as well as talking about a little bit things like netiquette and those sort of pieces. So Colleen, if you want to jump back in here.
Yeah, so, and I want to make a comment about one of the things that was said is that it was great to be in my breakout room, because I had someone in my breakout room who taught me things, so I feel like as an instructor, I absolutely will acknowledge that I don't know everything, because I don't, and I'm learning. So I think that's okay. This is like a process of exploration. That's what I'm saying. I don't have to be, I can be the expert of my field. I don't have to be the expert of Zoom. I'm getting better, but I guess that was just my comment. So don't worry. I don't think I would worry so much about that. So some of the things that I did last semester, and I think that are things that might be helpful, is the first thing is when I set up my Zoom, it was a recurring meeting. So I meet twice a week, and I'm going to be meeting from 9 to 10:30. And I'm going to set that up for the semester as a recurring meeting, because the link will remain the same throughout the semester. And then there's two things that you can do. You can see these are my classes from last semester. In the navigation bar of your class, you can put a Zoom meeting link. So I'm going to see if this will let me go there. Maybe not. But basically what you can do is, where you have content discussions, you can create a Zoom meeting link. And when you create that link and they click on it, it takes them right to the session. And then they just open Zoom. So it's a really nice, easy way. They get used to it very quickly, and they're able to jump into your meeting without any problem. Now, I always set up that I have to let them in, but at least they're sitting there in the right place easily. The second thing that you can do is, if you create a widget in D2L, and I suppose I can share my screen to show this. If you create a widget in D2L, of course I said that I could do that, and now I have to exit full screen. Then what you can do is, you can just put that on your widget. I'm sorry, it's not pulling up. I think when we messed, here we go. Do you see my class?
Yes.
Okay, so if I go to the class that I was going to show you, it basically has them sitting in the class. So the top of this class is where the Zoom meeting is. And when they click on it, all they have to do is click Open Zoom Meeting. So it's really simple. After the first week, everybody will know how to get there pretty easily. The other thing I've done is, I did virtual office hours last semester, and I'm going to do virtual office hours this semester. And basically what I do, and I know this is, it's different, but what I do is I put my virtual office hour link in my widget on the front page. And then the students, when they want to come to office hour, they just click on it and it brings them to the Zoom. And then they open it up. Now, I haven't done, last semester I didn't do appointments for my office hours, because I figured I'm sitting in my office during my office hours. So students can jump in when they want to. And what I think is actually incredible is, I saw more people in my office hours virtually than I ever see in my office hours personally. And whether it was because they didn't have to walk to my room, they just had to click on my easy link to come. And what I also saw is, I had students taking control of the office hour time, where a student would come in and say, I need for you to look at this paper that I'm writing. Here, I want you to look at this part. What do you think about that? So they were ready with questions when they clicked on the link. So it's kind of a nice way to actually be able to interact. And in our session, we were talking about having required office hours, people coming into your office hour for perhaps you're doing revisions. Really nice way for you to do that is just have them have a link, click on the link and come in, and they can go in a waiting room. So if you have 3 people, you can move through those students, give them some instruction and have them work on something and then move back to the next group. So really nice and really a really great tool for students to come see you. So I'm going to stop that share. So those are just some easy, I think for students, it has to be easy for them to connect with you. And those are just some easy ways to set your class up so that students can very easily get to those synchronous sessions or get to your office hours to talk with you. Okay.
So in addition to sort of sharing information, making those join links as easy as possible and kind of as accessible as possible, as Colleen mentioned, there's definitely benefit to talking with students, sharing some information ahead of time regarding expectations, as well as discussing expectations when you're in those first live synchronous sessions. And so with that, some of the things, one that often comes up is if you're going to have any policy about use of camera within the classroom or within synchronous sessions. I'll say if you are going to require cameras be on, that often comes up as sort of a question to be debated. Should you make it a requirement that all students have to have their camera on? If you are going to make that a requirement, I strongly encourage sharing with students the virtual backgrounds option. I've got a link to it here. I'll share it as well after in an email follow-up to everybody. In case either instructor or students don't want to share their sort of home background, they can bring up virtual backgrounds as a helpful sort of option there. Additionally, recognizing that if you're going to be potentially in somebody's home kind of virtually, explaining with folks that they do need to step away from the computer for any reason, sort of just muting themselves. And I would say really strongly encouraging and acknowledging that's completely okay, that if people need to step away from the computer, they certainly can. And also acknowledging that there will be technical issues, things that come up. I don't think you've heard, but throughout this entire session, my cat's been meowing at my door because I've had it closed. So just things come up. Certainly there can be reasons to kind of step away from the computer and kind of acknowledging that. In addition to preparing students with just what some of the features are, and you don't have to be an expert by any means, but just sharing some of the kind of tutorial videos about how to use features like chat, or the breakout room is the one that you see yourself using most often. I've included a small screenshot of me here kind of pointing to the chat feature. While the Zoom tutorials are really helpful, and while things like Brightspace tutorials are very helpful, if you have a minute to take I would say, kind of a screen grab of yourself using a feature or even a screencast, the more you can personalize that for your students within the first few weeks helps to kind of create that sense of connection with them and dispel maybe some of the myths about how hard it will be to use some of these technologies. Again, even if you're brand new to using these things, as you explore, I encourage you to think about taking some screenshots for students to kind of help them think about it as well. Additionally, sharing the class agenda and any materials that you're going to use within the class. So if you're going to be going over particular slides, if you're working within a Google Doc. For this session here, I didn't share that Google Doc in advance, but with a normal class session, I would absolutely want to have those things posted within the LMS so people can access that if they get kicked off of Zoom for some reason and those issues. A couple more things to mention here before we get towards the end, and we'll try and have a few minutes at the end for questions and try and cover things. In terms of platforms to use, I'm not going to go into too much detail about here's the absolute benefits of Zoom versus Google Meet versus D12 Virtual Classroom. We have those 3 here on the screen because those are the main 3 that folks have been using. All 3 of those have chat features. All 3 have the ability to share screen from both host and participant. All of them have waiting room features and the ability to record sessions. As of right now, Google Meet is a lot less feature heavy. So they currently don't have things like polling, like the raise hand, like the breakout rooms. If anyone here is a frequent user of Google products, though, you'll know that they're continually updating things. So everything that's listed as a no in that column, to my understanding, except for the D12 piece, Google is currently sort of in development if you go to their sites. So supposedly they'll work on these things. With these 3, the best thing I can recommend doing is taking time to have sort of individual meetings of yourself in these different platforms to see how it works for you as a host. I've probably spent more time, I'd like to admit, sort of in individual meetings, just testing things out with how it works within Zoom, how it works within D12 Virtual Classroom. If you have a smartphone as well, you can absolutely join a session through both computer and smartphone. I really recommend doing that as a practice. One thing to see how it works, to kind of join a session on a smartphone if you haven't before, to kind of see how the interface works. Additionally, it can let you do things like polling or even breakout rooms just amongst yourself while you kind of practice these pieces. Last thing we'll mention here before we open up for questions a little bit more is the topic of how to prevent unwanted guests from joining your class. So people might have heard before about what's often called Zoom bombing, so somebody who actually isn't within the class, somehow getting access to the join link and join the session, yelling profanities, doing things to disrupt the classroom. There's certain things you can do to try and prevent that. These are things I'll say that I would encourage doing. They're not going to absolutely guarantee that you won't have somebody kind of join the session. One is within Zoom using the waiting room feature. So real quick here, I'm going to just pull up, if I can, Zoom window. So if I'm scheduling a meeting within Zoom particularly, I'm choosing things like the date, the time, and initially under security, I have the option to enable the waiting room. And so for this session, this workshop today, I had the waiting room feature enabled so that every time somebody joined the session, I had to manually add them into the session. So it creates a security thing in the sense of you can see who's trying to join the session, you get the name of the person who's trying to join. Beyond the security piece, I would really recommend using waiting rooms because even though I haven't had folks necessarily try to join sessions who haven't been invited to them, I still really like as a host seeing who's joining when. Just so I can kind of greet people as they come in of, hey, Colleen, good to see you. Hey, Rodrigo, it's good to see you today. It's a really helpful sort of cue of who's there, knowing to kind of greet somebody. Additional pieces with Zoom and other features you can set up to where it has a meeting ID and a password. If you're going to share those pieces, rather than sharing the actual join link, if you just share the meeting ID and password, someone can go to the Zoom site, enter those, and join as well. Final thing is if you have any kind of public-facing aspect to your courses. So if you have sort of a course Twitter, if you do a course public-facing Google Sites, I'd really recommend keeping join links and passwords shared to the kind of password-protected LMS. So within D2L, if you're using Google Classroom, just the piece that's kind of password-protected, so it's not publicly broadcast what the actual link is. With that, so that's a lot to cover within an hour. Hey, I think we're actually right exactly at 2 o'clock. So Colleen, I've covered a lot of different things. Again, a lot of the purpose of this session is to share different approaches, share ideas, to demonstrate some of the tools with the hope that people can follow up later and kind of test some of these out. We'll stick around for a little bit here to talk through particular questions you'll have had, maybe go back to the chat a little bit. I'm going to stop sharing for the moment. So we're a little bit over to 2 o'clock. If you have to leave, absolutely feel free to. Otherwise, if you're able to stay, we're happy to kind of think through questions a little bit and talk through that. If you want to ask questions, I encourage probably typing things into the chat. Otherwise, if you want to raise hand, either physically, I'll look around and kind of call on folks, or if you want to on the participants page, raise hand as well. We'll go from there. And again, last thing I'll mention before we open for questions is practice, test things out in individual sessions with your colleagues, host Zoom sessions with your family. It's the best practice is to kind of go through and see how polling works, how breakout rooms actually work from both instructor and student perspective. So thank you all very, very much. Thank you very, very much, Colleen. At this point, we'll look at questions. Dave Lawrence, I know you've had your hand up, so if you want a question, you want to feel free to go down and mute yourself and ask, or we can think about it in the chat.
Yeah, I got a couple of questions. Colleen mentioned using a widget in D2L with with Zoom, and I really, really like that idea. Can we do the same thing with D2L Virtual Classroom?
That's something I don't know because I haven't used it, but my assumption is that D2L Virtual Classroom would also allow you to have that link. But I, to be honest, I don't know because I haven't used it.
I'm gonna try it because that was one of the difficulties students had was finding out how to get in and out of the meetings. And I use my math lab for homework, and I set up a separate widget for my math lab right on the home page, and they just click on it. They don't have to have any password. They just go right in, and they're if they've set it up and logged in, they just go straight in, and it makes it so much easier. The waiting room, Is there a waiting room on D2L Virtual Classroom?
If anybody else has used it more, feel free to chime in. In my very little experience with D2L Virtual Classroom, I believe there is, in the sense that you can still choose to admit people to the room. But if other people have a definite answer, feel free to chime in. If nobody else does, Dave, in that follow-up email, I'll definitely let you know if there's waiting room for a virtual classroom or not.
I can try it out too. I just looking for a shortcut way of figuring it out.
You know, if somebody knows, feel free to share in the chat or aloud.
Other questions?
Peggy, you had a question, it looks like, in the chat.
Yeah, can I share my screen real quick?
Yeah.
It's pertaining to D2L virtual classroom, and I wanted to try it out, but number one, I don't really know how, and then I went to these like training videos and stuff, and like, you know, I just kind of got overwhelmed and I gave up. But we did get this like fact sheet, and that I'm sharing now, and I know that here where it says number of webcams enabled, it says up to 7, but somebody told me that that's not the case. So I was just wondering, number one, how, I don't even know where to go to start the virtual classroom. Is it somewhere within D2L? And this business about the cameras.
So
I ran D2L Virtual Classroom last spring. I loved it. You can, obviously there's more than 7 cameras. I had full classes in it. I think it's a great way to go because there's no registration to it. As soon as you're set up in D2L, which all the classes I assume are now, as soon as the D2L class gets set up, the students are populated, and that's all you have to do. There are very little restrictions on it that I know of. And we have the premium version now, by the way.
And does it functions like Zoom? Then the same?
Yeah, it's very similar to Zoom. I use Zoom for some other things that I do outside of school, and I use the D2L Virtual Classroom for my classes, and it's very much like Zoom. If you go into the homepage on your class homepage, click on More on the right-hand side up at the top. Click on More, and then you get a pull-down menu and just click on. There you go. Yeah, there it is right there. Virtual Classroom down at the bottom of the More menu.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's okay. Thank you.
Yeah, and the beneficial thing is it's built into the D2L class, and so students should have that sort of tab as well at the top for accessing virtual classroom.
So they wouldn't have to worry about the link. Is this link expired, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, you have to set up the meetings, but
similar to Zoom, you can still set parameters for when a particular sort of meeting time is, but you also have the option to kind of click in there and join meeting now as well.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
And thanks, Dave.
Let me scroll through the chat for other questions. Or go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a quick question. I'm using Zoom. Has anybody been able to share, let's say you have a YouTube video or something, or you want to share something that the sound does not come across Zoom? Is there something that is newer now that allows? I wanted to play a song and my students couldn't hear it. They could see the video, but they couldn't hear it.
So within, and Allison's got your hand raised. Go ahead, Allison. Yeah.
Sabina, when you share the video at the bottom where in the share screen, there's a button you have to click that says share audio.
Can you see my, oh, you can't. Yeah, it's in the bottom left-hand corner.
Yeah, and with the share screen, you can do things like advanced sharing options, where you can just share the computer's audio without the video as well. So before this session, there was music playing. That was through that feature. And as Allison mentioned, yeah, you can choose to share computer's video and audio to allow for it.
So you can definitely watch a video or listen to music. It's pretty flexible that way in the things that you can share.
Other questions, things that have come up for folks? But additionally, I'm kind of soliciting questions. If people have used something you thought, hey, this worked really well within Google Meet, within Virtual Classroom, within Zoom, absolutely feel free to share suggestions in this time too, either through chat or through speaking.
Well, I liked what Colleen was talking about the office hours, and I wasn't sure. You talked about having the waiting room, and then they come in, and then you send them off to do something, and then they come back. I was wondering when they go off and on, they're exiting the classroom, and then they have to re-enter, or are you using breakout rooms?
They're in breakout rooms.
So when they
It's like
come.
a Zoom meeting.
So because what I've done, one way that I've used breakout rooms in my class is if I have a private conversation, I want to have somebody, I just create a room and then manually assign. And so you could just have a large discussion. You have the regular breakout rooms and you create another room for that person. You pull them out and you talk with them alone, and then you pull them back in, and then make sure nobody is listening. You know, even if, like, for example, right now at the end of class, let's say that you want to say something to somebody, one of us. If you create a breakout room, it's a lot more sure that nobody else is eavesdropping, you know. So I found that a very good use of breakout rooms. But
that's a good point. If you want a conference with somebody within the classroom and they're working, you could go into a one-on-one breakout room with them and do that.
Yeah. So, okay.
Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and stop recording.